So many of the people on the call today, I think I've met, or in some guise or other in the past. But my name is Damien Hatton. I'm the managing director here at InFocus and co-founder with Tom, and that's me. And InFocus is an organisation that basically helps social change professionals and organisations such as yourselves to strengthen, grow, and sustain your organizations and the actual initiatives and social change that you're trying to achieve in the world. I'm a senior trainer and coach and consultant at InFocus, and I've been previously a medical doctor in the NHS here in the UK, where I'm based. So a tropical diseases doctor, hence our mosquito. And what brought me into this whole arena of social change work and working in the charity and NGO sector was through setting up a charity myself back in 2000 called Street League, which is a sport for development initiative based here in the UK. And it helps originally young homeless people, but now we've narrowed that down to sort of 15 to 24-year-old individuals who've got a range of difficulties in their background, and we help them move into employment and training. And so that's a charity that I founded and ran for 10 years. And just a little bit of personal stuff. That's me up some mountain somewhere in the Alps. So that's when I'm not number crunching and consulting. I'm often found up a mountain somewhere where I like to contemplate life. No, I just enjoy time. Let me hand over to TJ.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I obviously am TJ McGovern, based out of Indianapolis, Indiana, and I've been in the nonprofit sector, kicking around the space about 20 years. My primary background is in higher ed fundraising, and about 5 years ago, I started my own nonprofit consulting firm focusing on fundraising, board development, strategic clarity, and I serve clients nationwide. In a lighthearted way, I'd like to say I'm an accidental fundraiser with a teacher's heart. So I really enjoy helping clients get where they want to go. On a personal funny note, those of you that are US based, if you remember the TV show with Ron Howard, and his name was Opie Taylor. And when I was a kid, that's me when I think I was like 6 or 7 years old, and come from a large extended family. They used to call me Opie. So if you do a little Google search while waiting to get into this great webinar, you can see that the similarities. Unlike Ron Howard, who's a great screen actor and of course now a producer, I do have my hair. On a personal note, I am blessed most days with twins. That's my twins, Tom and Lucy. And they are teenagers now, so I've moved into the stage of their really sweet pains. So, and then lastly, on an even more personal note, to manage stress, to be the kind of person I want to be, I practice the martial art of Aikido. I've been doing that for about 20 years as well, and just really love the community and the physical aspect of the whole art. So turn it back over to you, Damien.
Very impressive, TJ. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned before, this first section will really give you just a bit of an overview of the main areas we're talking about today. So first of all, we have monitoring and evaluation. So as an organization, we've boiled down process of working through and putting in place strong monitoring and evaluation systems into what we call our 7 steps to high performance. You know, the monitoring and evaluation is a core expertise within this process, and there's many processes similar to this that take people through the steps of building one's capacity to do this work and to put in place monitoring and evaluation processes. This is our particular process, which we're proud of from the point of view it really tries to tackle some of the complexities and make it more accessible and understandable by social change professionals. So getting rid of some of the jargon in there. So we have 7 steps. I won't take you through these in detail, but step 1 is really about, preparing the way and making a strong roadmap for what you need to improve and how you're going to develop your processes and capabilities in this that will lead your organization and yourself to be able to improve the performance of both your programs, the organization, but also become more accountable and sustainable. So that means understanding, what you're doing well right now, because you'll find that you're probably doing many aspects of this process already, some to better standards than others, and with limited time and effort that everybody has around building capacity and improving your systems and processes, you need to target that effort. So it's a really important step, really understanding where to focus your inputs. And our second step is about designing focused and effective solution. So really understanding what you're trying to achieve, how change happens, and the role that you're really actively going to play in that change process. Step 3 is all about then, with that framework and that blueprint in mind, developing a high performance framework or a strong monitoring and evaluation framework that allows you to track progress and understand, when you've actually achieved the results that you're looking to achieve. Step 4 is about then being able to put in place the right data collection tools and instruments and plans to help you collect that information and make those understand those progress indicators and how well you're doing in towards your end goals. Step 5 is about collecting and managing your data. And step 6 is then, and steps 6 and 7 are really about using data. So you've gone to all this effort, steps 1 to 5. Step 6 is about using data to improve performance. How do you apply those insights that you've gained from information and data to actually drive the performance of your whole organization to do better, to do more consistent results for more of the beneficiaries that you're working with? And step 7 is kind of another side to that. It's using data for accountability and financial sustainability. And it's this step 7 actually that we're somewhat talking about today, because this is one of the key roles for monitoring and evaluation, and having such a set of processes in place is to help more effective fundraising, more effective accountability back to funders, and creating that level of sustainability within the organization to allow you to continue into the future. So we're focusing on this in today's webinar, which hopefully gives a bit of context for why do monitoring and evaluation. And at the bottom we've got investor and donor ready, and really that's the combination of putting these capacities and skill bases and processes in place. It's one of the kind of reasons why, from a fundraising perspective, is donors and investors are looking for organizations who display certain attributes that make them investable. So we call that being investor and donor ready, to be able to accept grants and be in a good position to win grants off donors and investors. So that's our context in terms of the monitoring evaluation piece. But let's just do a quick recap on the types of fundraising that are available. So there are many different ways of fundraising, and what we have here is we call our 7 pillars of fundraising below, which give a kind of a run through of the many different ways and approaches. So we've got grants on the left hand side, which are a very important source of funds and for For most non-profits, billions of dollars and pounds are provided each year from local, state and federal governments, and the trick's really knowing how to get your hands on some of that. In terms of donations, certainly here in the UK, often we think that's a little bit tricky to get to access as an NGO. Sometimes we consider ourselves too small to actually access. I know it's quite different in the US. I mean, TJ, perhaps you could speak to the sort of donations that happen in the US there. I know it's a little bit different to here in the UK.
Yeah, a little bit. 72% of all philanthropic donations here in the U.S. come from the cohort or the group of individuals. And then if you include bequests in that, which most of the time comes from individuals as well, you're looking about 80% of all philanthropic dollars come from individuals. The rest, of course, by corporations and foundations. So yeah, it is a unique thing here in the U.S.
And is it fair enough to say that kind of, having the right administration processes in place is a pretty key aspect of that, of accessing and working on donations in this way?
Very, very much so. You need to have, well, I'll say it this way. You need to ask people at the right time for the right amount in the right place. That's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, great. So crowdfunding is our third pillar here, which is online fundraising campaigns that are, usually based around a specific project, and they tend to have a very clear fundraising target that's been set, and multiple people tend to pledge an amount. And what's unique about this is the use of technology that's really driven crowd fundraising, but also that you need to actually hit that pledged amount before it releases the full sum of monies to you. But it's an increasingly interesting source of funding that's driving lots of unique projects around the world now. So crowdfunding is another source. Memberships. So a membership program, often associated with schools, universities, and alumni programs, can really provide a good source of renewable funds for an organization. And I think what's specific about membership programs is that they really need to foster that sense of belonging among supporters to the cause, to the institute, and hence how it's often associated with something that they've been through, like a school or a university. So we've then got events. Many of us run all sorts of different events across the year, so lots of various athons, walkathons, runathons, but also different themed events. There's Movember, there's FebFast, there's lots of different fates and festivals that can be served as generating revenues. We've got sales. So we're really talking about that ability for a charity or an organization to sell what it knows or what it does or what it has indeed. So one of the great freedoms that comes from monetizing your product, whether that's your knowledge about a matter in terms of consultancy and supporting others, is that the money generated from selling effectively an element of what you do or know becomes untied money. So it's this type of money that is unrestricted in its subsequent usage, whereas many grants are tied to specific usages, which gives a certain amount of freedom. And then finally, just to mention sponsorships. So this is where really partnership working often between businesses and non-profits can be forged to benefit not just the charity, but often also the business itself. So and that may include models such as volunteering or in-kind donations or pro bono contributions of a corporate services to the charity. or donations and matching donations through staff giving schemes, etc. So lots of different forms of sponsorship also available. So I think two of the key principles here in fundraising as well is having a good mix of funding to increase financial sustainability. And as I was just talking about in terms of sales and restricted versus unrestricted money, tied versus untied money, it's good to be able to build up some element of unrestricted funding so that you can invest in the areas that perhaps donors aren't too keen on supporting, as often donors will want to focus in on projects tangible projects that they can invest monies in. Anything to add on that, TJ? I know it's sort of a whirlwind through in terms of types of fundraising.
I can't echo the importance of having a good mix and not over relying on one source of funding for a variety of reasons that are pretty evident. But I see a lot of organizations, unfortunately, that are only relying on one or maybe two of these funding sources. So the more diverse you can be, like in a personal asset base, in terms of the nonprofit that you're involved with, having that diverse base is important for long-term success.
Yeah, great. And I've just got a question here in from Dorina. Where would you include service provision contracts? And thanks for that question, Dorina. And I would place those within sales. So commissioning for services, often where an organization, where a public sector body, for example, may well put out a commission for specific outcomes that they're looking for. That's where I would place that one. So that's just a quick overview of types of fundraising and M&E. So what's the importance of M&E to funders? Well, there's four areas I'll just mention here in terms of, first of all, accountability requirements. So funders really need to know that their funding has been used for its intended purposes. They also need to know how expenditure has been used compared to the original proposals, and whether the funding can be tracked and is relevant in audited accounts. So accountability for usage of money and the results achieved is a key part of what you're helping a funder do around its own accountability requirements. And those vary from funder to funder in terms of the, if you like, the intensity of those requirements. Second, I'd focus on demonstrating and learning from achievements. So how effective has your program been? Have any issues arisen along the way that you could learn from? And how can often learning be brought to the sort of policy table? Funders are often engaged with policy agendas and advocacy type work. So being able and enabling a funder to understand how programs are working and learn from those is an important element. Learning about funder practice. So this is another thing that most funders are, or many funders are interested in, is about their own practice of interacting, distributing grants, engaging with grantees. How is the work that the funder itself is doing? They may do some additional elements to their grant making, such as capacity development work. They may be supporting you indeed with your development of monitoring and evaluation. Increasingly, we're finding that funders are open to doing that and supporting their network of grantees round their, your monitoring and evaluation efforts. So how has that worked? Has that been helpful in meeting your own strategic aims and objectives as an organization? And then finally, this concept of good value, which is an increasing kind of term that's used in the sort of in the funders world, one of getting good value for money. And we'll talk a little bit more about that into the next slide. And really relate value for money in terms of in monitoring and evaluation terms, how that's expressed and how you express value for money in monitoring and evaluation terms. So this is a definition from the National Audit Office here in the UK. So value for money is really about the optimal use of resources to achieve intended outcomes. Outcomes being the changes that you create through your programs and your intervention. So value for money in DFID's program, so that's the Department for International Development here in the UK, means that they aim to maximize the impact of each pound and dollar spent to improve poor people's lives. Again, that's DFID's definition. And DFID actually uses this 3E's framework, which is actually a useful way of kind of conveying value for money in monitoring and evaluation terms. So you'll see at the top here various terminologies which you may or may not be familiar with that come from this world of monitoring and evaluation. Inputs, which are effectively the things that you put into a program: money, staff time, materials, capital. Process, which is very much about what are the things that you actually do. Outputs are really the results delivered, the immediate results delivered through programs and activities that are run and the processes. And then outcomes being the changes that are brought about in the target audience who you're working with. So these are increasingly, as you go to the right-hand side, we'll see impact, which are the longest term changes, in community, in society, in the individuals that you're actually working with. And you'll notice as you move to the right-hand side, there's a gradual increase in how difficult it is to actually measure some of these elements. So I often think this is, so in terms of relating this to value for money, they have these 3E concepts. So one of economy, so which is, are we buying inputs? Are we putting our inputs in effectively? Efficiency is all about turning inputs into outputs, and how well do our grantees, for example, or the organizations we give money to, convert their funding grant into actual results, short-term results from their program. So that's about efficiency. Effectiveness is all about how those outputs from an intervention are actually achieving the desired outcomes. In this instance, very much looking at poverty reduction. And cost effectiveness is really this idea of how much impact on the end goal, poverty reduction in this instance, does this intervention achieve relative to the inputs that are being put in. So these are the kind of ways that, so why is this useful to us? I mean, this is really about understanding the thinking that is existing with certain, so these kind of institutional donors and bigger donors, whilst there are certainly considerable difficulties with evidencing, and you may be sat there going, well, I as an organization can't evidence impact. I have no resource to do that. I think the most important thing to take away from this is that this is a frame of thinking that exists in donors' minds now. And if you can express and speak the language of inputs, processes, outputs, and how you can be more efficient and effective and understand the relationships here, actually you can speak in a language that is very, makes you very amenable to to these sorts of institutional donors. So, but this concept of value for money is something that's becoming more prevalent in terms of certainly why donors are so interested in organizations taking the monitoring and evaluation process seriously, in order to give them a chance to really demonstrate value for money. As you'll notice as I go through this this presentation, different links are popping up. Just to let you know, we'll provide these links in a follow-up email after the webinar so that you've got access to a reading list effectively. There's a lot of information that we're imparting here. Some I won't go through entirely in this webinar, so you can go back and have a look at it at a later point. So that's our first section in terms of an overview of both fundraising and monitoring and evaluation. And what I'd like to now dive into is our second section, which is really what is the one most important skill base that you really need to acquire when thinking about fundraising. And this is where I'd like to actually bring TJ in, because I know TJ is knows about the particular importance of this to your clients, and I know you teach a lot of skills and a lot of organizations around this skill base of storytelling. Now, TJ?
I'm here.
Can I, yeah. Would you like to speak to these this storytelling piece? Sure. Now?
So I think the importance of a good story in the nonprofit sector can't be stressed enough. And if you can really craft a good story about your organization to capture people's attention about the great work that all of you are doing, I think it's of vital importance. So it's a way to connect with funders and investors and donors. And, you know, if you think about it, storytelling has been around since human beings have been on this planet. I jokingly say it's the oldest form of social media. If you want to connect with someone, tell them a really, really good story. So in prep for today, I want to kind of tell you in an encapsulated way what I use with clients, and I call it a story spine. And it's taken from the Actors Institute out of California. And basically, there's 5 very simple steps to tell a great story. So one is reality is introduced. How can you translate reality to those individuals or groups that your nonprofit serves? And step number 2 is some kind of conflict arises. It could be loss of income that leads into homelessness and then into poverty, or any other scenario that would fit with the work of your organization. Number 3 is there's an inevitable struggle as a result of some kind of loss. Number 4, conflict is resolved, and I often say that's a real opportunity to tell the work of your organization with your help, this group, individual, community was moved back into a place of where they were before, or even a better place. They got a job, they bought their first home, I could keep going. And then lastly, the new reality exists. And that is another place where I coach clients to tell stories around emblematic success stories. And what I mean by that is investors and donors, in my experience, don't want to hear about the 100,000 kids that you serve. They want to hear one story about one kid, one family, or one community. And as I like to say, no stories without numbers and no numbers without stories. Damien, what do you think about that?
Yeah, great. So it really sets the scene, because what we're going to just talk about here and run through for the next sort of 20 minutes or so is is this idea of storytelling. And then we're going to come, the final third section of this presentation is really then how does M&E help that story and help you tell a more effective and powerful story. So that, you frame that great, very effectively for us there, TJ. But as well as telling the story, it's also about telling the right story. So we raise, I think the point of this slide here is that we raise money from people, not organizations. And it's about the story that that person who you're speaking to, wants to hear or needs to hear. So understanding the audience is probably the key point here. And I think storytelling, if any of you got children and you're used to telling them stories at night time, certainly in my experience, the book that I always want to read, they never want to read. You're really going to hit a brick wall if you try to force your child to listen to your particular story. So you have to understand what they want to know to hear that particular evening. And I think that's a great analogy, in actual fact, for thinking about your funders. You don't want them throwing their teddies out of their pram. So you want to understand what they're actually needing to hear and what they'd like to hear. So the real story you should be telling in fundraising is not the story about your organization. It's the story about the donor. So that's another important point, putting your donor in the story. Certainly when I say Leo was asked to step up and fly the plane, when we get to that part of his favorite particular book, is the big jaw-dropping moment, and when we can place our donors in our own stories of how change is happening through our organization and through their contribution. It's much more compelling. So another point really just around as we frame this idea of a story, but I'll ask you again just to talk us through this one, TJ, because I know this slide's come from yourself in terms of a bit of science behind storytelling.
There is. So kind of jumping back for a moment about, storytelling is the oldest form of social media, where we sat around campfires and told stories about ourselves, our families, our communities, heritage, that kind of thing. I'm lucky enough to be married to a neuropsychologist. So I asked her recently, is there any research about how storytelling affects the brain? And my wife was kind enough to share this. So parts of the brain are activated when you tell a very good story, whether it's to children or to a potential investor. So, part of the brain that called neural coupling, it activates parts of the brain that allows the listener to turn the story into their own ideas and experience in this process. So it's where someone will enter into your story. So when I work with organizations and we're crafting their stories and their storylines, I'll ask them to go out and test a story with people that really are supportive of the organization. Have them ask that question: where in the story I just shared with you about the work of our organization, where did you fall into it? Secondly, mirroring, listeners will not only experience the similar brain activity to each other, but also to the speaker. So in essence, that's a fancy way of saying that there's a form of connection between the storyteller and the person that's actually listening to it. It's connected. So a good story releases dopamine into the brain, into the system, and activates the emotional part of the brain. And I can honestly say that most of the giving that I've experienced in my lifetime as a consultant on my own personal level has been emotional. People give because it helps them feel good. There's research as outlined here to support that. And then lastly, there are facts, and I keep going back to that thing I would hope be a good takeaway for everyone on the webinar now, is that just don't tell a story without numbers. And often I see, at least here in the U.S., that people just overwhelm, donors, investors, constituents with all these numbers and not backing up with the story. So make sure you have both. And lastly, that cortex activity is when processing the facts, the brain areas are activated, and a well-told story can engage many additional areas. So that is just a great way to think about it, grounded in science, and to ensure that Damien and I are just not making this stuff up.
Yeah, and as a former doctor, I strongly appreciate your brain reference here. So yes, we've got a bit of science going on here that good stories do genuinely activate and work on the individual level. So just going back now to sort of some of the stages and steps that you were talking through there, TJ, earlier. So kind of story writing tips, because we're going to stick with this story writing theme for a moment before we go to monitoring and evaluation and how that can help you with your story. But we've got our cat up a tree here. Would you like to just talk us through this one, TJ?
Sure. So, there's many different ways to frame how you can tell a great story. And I alluded to the story spine, but this is even a more compact and concise way. Any great story you can think about is from one of your favorite childhood books to the Star Wars trilogy follows this framework. And I invite you, when you're crafting stories for your organization, to follow the story spine or this even more compact way. So the first act is get your hero up a tree. The second act is throw stones at him. And the third act is to get him down. So if you think about any story that you resonate with, that is the underlying groundwork, frame of reference in order to tell a story. Most of the time I see a lot of organizations just focus on the third act, or in the story spine model, the conflict is resolved. You need to really set up the story about an individual, community, whatever that unit of impact for your organization looks like, and really paint the picture of the struggle, the hardships that they went through here, throw stones at them. And then here's the beautiful part. As a result of the work of your organization, you get them down from that tree and their life is somehow transformed.
Great. Thanks, TJ. And for the cat lovers amongst us, we're not endorsing throwing stones at cats here. We too like cats, but as a way of example. So back to the spine idea that we talked about. We're going to use this for our exercise just coming up in a moment, actually. We talked about characters. We talked about sort of naming the protagonist and the antagonist and fixing them in time and space. So every story has characters, and making sure you invest time in describing, who you're working with and who or what the antagonist is. So the antagonist could be the system, could be a process, could be people, could be a lack of opportunities, etc. But really understanding these two characters is a good investment of time. The second spine component is conflict, creating that event, that incident, the event, something that throws the protagonist's world out of balance. Thirdly is the struggle, the barrier to the protagonist runs into along the way. And finally, the goal. So celebrating that achievement, and if the goal wasn't met, sharing the particular lessons along the way. So these are just some tips around storytelling that was great that TJ you could put together for us. But I'd like to just go into a bit of an exercise now to get everybody thinking a little bit who's on the call. And I'd like you to, using the structure, the spine structure we've just talked about, with these four elements, CCSG, characters, the protagonist and the antagonist, the conflict that arises, the struggle and the goal. I want you to jot down a story about your organization. So we're gonna kind of give you a few minutes to do this, because I want you to go through this process of just applying it to a story that really fires you up about your organization. So one that you're passionate about, that always gets people going whenever you mention this particular story. Because look, there's hundreds, dozens of stories you could be telling about your organization and about what it does and what it was, but there may be something that particularly fires you up. So what I'd like you to do as part of this exercise, because what we're going to do next is sort of just look into the story themselves and ask a few questions and get a little bit of feedback. If you're keen to sort of share on this exercise, it'd be great for you to put your hand up as well, and because we'll be asking a few questions and getting hopefully a few other voices in the mix. So just take 3 minutes. I'm going to go offline for a moment, and if you could just jot down a story that uses that structure, that would be great. Great. Hi, TJ. I hear your switch back on. So welcome back, everybody. I've just given us a few minutes there to think about our own stories, because I'd like to just invite anybody to really just consider their story now. So back to our next question, in terms of what elements your story is. You know, when you reflect on your story that you've just perhaps jotted down, you know, what are the elements that you find most difficult to tell? Or indeed, how could it be more compelling? So I don't know whether anybody would like to contribute, I mean, this is the scary bit, is asking, see if anybody is happy to put their hand up and tell us a little bit about their story that they've looked at there, and just give us an idea of, you know, what's coming up for each of you in terms of, you know, the difficulties that you might be experiencing in telling the stories, or indeed how might a story become even more compelling. So I'm going to go to Sri Radhika.
Hi, Damien.
Hi, Sri Radhika. How are you?
I'm good.
Thanks for electing yourself.
So there's this story that is actually, it happened last year. There were two sisters from our school, Rashmi and Gauri, and they were coming to school regularly and everything was fine. But their father fixed their marriage when they were just 12 and 14, and along with their other sisters. So basically, child marriage is very common in this area. So they were taken out of the school and they stopped coming to school. And then what happened? So basically, the child protection team intervened after we came to know about what was happening. And with the help of the police, the child marriage, they stopped the marriage of these girls, and then now they're back in school.
Fantastic. So that in a very short space of time captures something that's key about what you're doing. And how would you, is that a story, that's a story that you tell frequently within FFLV, I guess. How would you see yourself enhancing that story further? Is there any elements of it that aren't don't work for you as well?
The thing is that if we have to keep something short, and how to communicate the emotion of what a girl goes through when she's actually taken out of the school and put to an adult role at an early age. And it's a very difficult thing to just, you know, because there is a whole thing behind it. It's a very, very long, you know, there are a lot of things connected to it, and you can't just in a very short brief story communicate that to the readers. And of course people don't have a lot of time to listen to your story, so that is the most difficult element, is to communicate the emotion correctly so the people feel involved in a part of, you know, okay, there is this problem and we need to help, or, you know, solve this problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. No, thanks for sharing that with us, Sri Radhika. That's really helpful. Have you anything to add on that, TJ, in terms of, you know, kind of your insight around telling stories and how to, you know, how to overcome this challenge of getting your story across in a short period of time?
Sure. I would invite that, you know, to bring emotion into that story that was told in a very compact way. And usually what I do is I'll say, no, can I tell you a brief story, and then frame it? It's, you know, 2-3 minutes long. So with the situation with the children, you can bring in those emotions and the experiences from their point of view. I think that would amplify the impact of that great story framework.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think, I mean, from my perspective, the more depth and detail you can give to the protagonists and their situation is a great use of time in conveying a story. You know, what are the motivations of those protagonists, of the girls? What's the motivation of if you like, the antagonist, or the person who sort of you know, we want to change, the father in that case, in this instance. You know, understanding a little bit in a bit more depth and richness those situations, and by describing those characters in a bit more depth, I think the conflict that exists really emerges through the actual description, oftentimes, but by rounding out the story and having all four elements in place, you you know, nobody feels kind of cheated at the end of the story and not getting the punchline, etc. So I thought you covered all the parts here. We've also got another example online from Tessera, who's online. There's not a lot of time to write up a beautiful story, but there is my example. Priya was responsible for taking care of her family while her brothers were able to attend school. She had to do chores and generate an income. As an uneducated young woman, she had to have the means to cope with these challenges. Then she heard about a sport for development program, which she joined. She did not only play sports, but learned important life skills related to economic skills and social support. So thanks for sharing that very quickly and rapidly written up story, which, you know, has got those components of the characters, but obviously with more time you would be able to actually get into more depth around the struggle, etc. that exists for those. For this young woman in this instance, and you know that the struggle is the main plot, if you like, as well within these stories. I always like to think in terms of it's where the grit of the plot and the story really comes out. So what we'll do now is, oh, and look what I've just done. It's the joy of using. Pressing the wrong buttons at just the wrong time. Okay. Let me just whiz backwards a little bit. Okay. So the final element here is just the different kind of stories that you can tell. So we've just heard there about two beneficiary stories, in effect, which are obviously, these individual case studies are very compelling and are often the stories that we'll want to focus upon. But there's a number of other stories. There's stories about the organization and the founding of the organization, which again, you can use these components of character, conflict, struggle, and goal to actually structure not just a story, but also presentations, reports, because just remember that the skill of storytelling is something that can be applied and applied effectively across, you know, lots of different modes of communicating with people. It's not just a verbal communication, but it's a structure to a written story, report. They all contain these elements, and if you miss them out, one element out, and only focus on one or the other, it weakens the overall story. But the types of story and the settings of those stories can also change. So we talk about a case study story, but we also talk about a founding or an organizational story, or a very personal story, the history story of how the organization has come about, and what's happened in the past, and the legacy that it's left up to now, as well as the planning story of how we will actually get there and how we'll achieve things. So there's also different aspects of story, which in our notes that'll follow up from this, we'll give you a little list as well of the different kinds of stories that people can move into. So I guess the question now is, how can M&E help? How can monitoring and evaluation help? And as TJ mentioned before, no stories without numbers, and no numbers without stories is a key reference point here. Many charities that we'll run into, and this is a good use of my zombie here, which I try to fit into most of my presentations, but they'll stumble along without realizing how important using the products and learning from M&E efforts is for fundraising. And that's really what we'd like to mention now, so, and go into. But before we go into the sort of M&E piece here and how this can support your story, we're just going to run a very quick poll, and we'll ask this question. So how often do you utilize your M&E results and data. And that can be primary or secondary, so that means data that you may have collected or other people may have collected, or you may have from, previous research reports or things you've all read from elsewhere. So primary or secondary results or data within your fundraising efforts. So just a very quick poll. We've just sent that out again via your screen in top right. You can answer that poll for us, and we'll just have a look at those results shortly. So what stories does your audience want or need to hear? So I'm not going to go into detail in this section because it's a lot of writing, but the main point that I want to get across here is that there are different characters who to whom you will be applying for funds. And so we've got one persona here, an example, and I'm not going to say that you can generalize about people because everybody's different, but you do get some similar attributes of people who work in certain institutes. So this is our local government education commissioner. And I'm just going to, read this one out as an example. You can come back to this Prezi and see some of the other examples. But this individual works for local government. So I work for local government, responsible for commissioning support for providing social services in our region. Before working for local government, I was a junior researcher with the Department for Work and Pensions, and I have a social science academic background. I enjoy my job, but recent austerity measures at a national government level have made my job much more challenging with budgets much tighter. So the reason we're giving this profile is this is the kind of sort of intelligence that you want to really understand and try and understand about the person who you're dealing with. And it is a person thing. So in response to this, what I need is a grantee who can provide me with evidence that they've spent our money effectively. I need to know that money spent on this project is a good use of our limited resources compared with spending it upon another project. What I value most is projects that directly address my policy areas. So what we're really just trying to communicate here is that there is a persona behind and a personality with needs and a job that needs to be done. And that job can vary according to the context, the type of funder. So this particular funder needs to really, make that value for money case. It's much more important to, and often is the case with government resources and government funds, that they'll need to make the case for every pound put in, what the return is going to be. And so knowing that is important in terms of how, speaking to that need and making it easy for this particular individual to give you and your organization funds and resources, because they know and they can act with confidence that you're going to be able to help them in their particular job. So getting your head inside of what their needs are and speaking to those needs is a very good way of then subsequently shaping your priorities for what monitoring and evaluation capacities you really need to fall into place. Trust and foundation managers. So I won't read out this long profile here, but what he needs is a grantee who can demonstrate that they're a learning organization, that they've understood the complexity of the work that they're undertaking, are innovative in their approach, and can communicate the lessons learned. We're happy to take some calculated risks with our funds. I also need to know how well we are doing as a funder to help you in your journey, and are happy to be challenged to get better. So rather than sort of the value for money piece here, this particular grant manager has less pressure on accounting for every pound and penny spent, but what they want to know is that that you're learning, that the organization is understanding its data and responding according to it. So it's a different type of need that this individual has from the M&E that you're going to provide them. Corporate CSR manager, well, they need to They need to communicate. What I need, this lady needs, is a grantee who can provide great stories to communicate to our staff and board members. I need projects that can bring their story to life in colourful and engaging ways. So there's different needs, and I won't go into all of these just because of the limited time. But what the point there is really about understanding the audience for your monitoring and evaluation. So the key is, in terms of fundraising, how can our monitoring and evaluation help you tell that story? And there's two broad aspects to how you can you use your M&E. Well, you can use the credibility that comes from having robust monitoring and evaluation and processes in place to give donors confidence that you're the kind of organization. Yes,
TJ. Do we want to talk about the poll results? They're in.
Okay, great. Let's reveal the poll results before we get on to the third board. Yes.
Okay. So about 3/4 of our participants weighed in, and 13% said they always utilize, 63% said sometimes, and 25% said rarely.
Great. So what does that tell us, TJ?
I would say that the rarelies and the sometimes, hopefully there'll be some actionable takeaways from our webinar today that they can move into that always piece, because going back to numbers and stories and numbers really capture people's attention, particularly as it applies to M&E.
Yeah. And I guess that's thinking about the question as well. How often do you utilize M&E within fundraising efforts? I guess there's a broad tranche of different fundraising efforts that you might do. So I would be very surprised if the answer for somebody was never. So we've gotten 0% on never, because I think it's almost impossible not to engage with some of the products of M&E, during fundraising, even if you're perhaps not intentionally doing it. But I think it's that intentionally looking for how you can bring information into the case and making your case that, as you said, TJ, may well drive up those percentages to always. So thanks for that. So how can M&E help you tell your story? Well, in this last sort of 15-20 minutes, we'll just we'll take you through 3 elements. So what is your story? And helping be able to define that story is an important part of what monitoring and evaluation can help you do. Establishing the credibility of the story. People don't just swallow any old information that they're given these days. There's a skeptical eye upon particularly organizations that make claims and there is nothing really to back those claims with. So credibility is an important aspect of what M&E can bring, and being able to sort of distribute and actually use and communicate the story effectively. So the different modalities of reporting and using your data both to kind of keep existing funders and grow and engage new funders. So I'm going to go through some specifics. So we've got theory of change. Some of you may have already know about theory of change, but a theory of change can be a powerful way of actually telling the story. So we often encourage people to put a theory of change together, because this really links together how activities lead to social change, and an expression of a good allows an organization to really express that they really understand the situation that they're operating in. So we have many different types of theories of change, and many different forms in which it might take. This is an example from Comic Relief, and this is really just a one-page summary of a theory of change. What sits behind a theory of change is often a more detailed narrative that describes these different elements, which we've numbered here 1 to 4. But this one describes the challenge. So this is from a Tech for Good project. So technology being used in organizations to bring about improvements in social change. So there's an expression here on the left-hand side of the actual challenge. Many nonprofits are not reaching their potential to use digital to deliver better services. Digital projects often don't start or are not successful or sustainable because of fear, a lack of confidence, skills, insufficient funding, or limited internal support for new projects. So we've got an expression of the challenge. We've got an expression of, what needs to be done. And then subsequently, in terms of outcomes, what is the chain of outcomes leading to the end goal? Not-for-profits deliver more effective services, improve access to their services, and improve outcomes for their intended beneficiaries. And then underpinning this is a set of assumptions or beliefs that Comic for Relief, in this instance, believe about how this model actually works. So digital projects have sufficient support from management within nonprofits. So that's an important assumption that's being just stated here as something that, as a belief that about something that already exists. So a theory of change, not only does it become a framework for subsequently designing a monitoring and evaluation system and prioritizing what to measure and doing it in a very logical and systematic way, it becomes good grist, good content for your story, and it really helps you plan out that story. But you may not have a theory of change. You may have other elements of strategic documents. So you may have a strategic plan that lays out the vision and the mission, again, that can be used as a powerful framework for your story to express it. And this is an example from Care International of their strategic plan that's laid out on their website. So both elements are strong elements of monitoring and evaluation, having a framework such as theory of change or a strategic plan that lays out what's going to get done. And really, those can really bolster the whole story. So making your story credible is the next point here, where monitoring and evaluation can come in. So this image here is really takes me back to when I was actually doing Street League, and I used to tell the story about how sports, because sport is one of the important components of Street League, in engaging young homeless people in London, and it was just London at the time. And I used to talk quite passionately about how they came for the football. And following our sort of, looking into it a bit further and doing some surveys and interviews with our participants, what we figured out was actually why they were coming was for the hot food that we were actually laying on. Now, subsequently, the football and the sport that we put on was an important, powerful part of their journey to getting a job and moving on. But actually, the hook for them that we found was actually us laying on hot food and at the time. So the point here is that the story might change, but telling the right story and an accurate story is something that monitoring and evaluation can certainly help you do. Using evidence and writing. So your M&E can help you tell an evidence-based story. So we've been talking about the story and the different elements to putting together a story, but bolstering it with the facts of the matter, which can be both from what information that you've taken and developed from your own programs, but also from other research that's gone on, secondary research that you might want to look at. So just a quote here: without the imaginative insight which goes with creative literature, history cannot be intelligibly written. So using evidence and intertwining it into your story. But you also need to trust the evidence. So the credibility of the story really depends to a large extent on the quality of your data. So we've got our rubbish going in, rubbish going out analogy here. So part of the whole credibility piece is about having high quality monitoring and evaluation. So good quality M&E can help to ensure that the data is leading to a good standard of evidence. So there are certain components like collecting through a set of indicators, training staff to collect data, using well-designed tools, setting out processes for collecting data and sampling, and understanding how you're going to sample people, as well as training staff to analyze and report on the data, are all kind of components of a quality monitoring and evaluation system. So what I'd like to do here is just run another very quick poll. I'm going to launch it again. And the question that we're posing here is, in which areas do you feel better data or information would most enhance your fundraising efforts? So I'm just putting this out there again, and we'll see the results at the end. So in terms of the areas we're looking at here is who you work with and why you work with them, the nature and size of the problem and the challenges faced, what needs to change and the end goals, innovations and plans to bring about change, and the results achieved to date and lessons learned. So those are the areas that we'll just run that poll through. So using your story effectively. So there's two aspects that M&E can help in terms of telling your, in relation to both keeping funders who you've already got and also securing new funders. So this is really about how to, communicate this information back, and again is a key part of the monitoring and evaluation process. So first of all, we've got reporting back. Now, what you'll find is we'll often talk about findings, conclusions, and recommendations. These are kind of the elements of your monitoring and evaluation that funders are often interested in. And it's an opportunity here to really share the learning through your findings, conclusions, and recommendations. An analogy here is visiting a doctor, where the findings would be the symptoms, the conclusion would be the diagnosis, and the recommendation, the treatment. And so thinking about this structure of framing and telling the story about what's happened now and what's occurred through your programs, you want to lay this information out. And a lot of this information comes from some of our other courses that we've run in the process, one of which is Writing Effective Reports course, to be able to communicate, your data more effectively. So is there sufficient evidence? So to draw a particular conclusion. So I'm just going to focus here on a couple of things and tips really around how to avoid some of the pitfalls, if you like, of reporting back to your funders and donors. And one of those is about drawing conclusions. And we've got Sherlock Holmes here, and a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes novel. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. So one of the things to be careful about when you are starting to report back data is how you're actually going about using, because whilst you will be applauded for for applying monitoring and evaluation to your projects, there is a temptation at this stage when reporting back to use data in certain ways that suit your situation, and often that undermines your case. So to what extent you can actually attribute conclusions back to your activities, you really need to consider before kind of actually reporting those things. And unless you're very sure about a conclusion, we often recommend using much more neutral language, within your final reports, and avoiding sweeping statements. These are some of the things that trip people up in terms of just looking at the plausibility of some of the results that people feed back through their monitoring and evaluation. 97% of our participants experienced a positive change. It doesn't always sound too credible or useful or specific enough. So supporting narrative with data. I'm conscious we're coming towards our end of our hour and a half here, but as we discussed earlier in the webinar, it can be very powerful to use both numbers and stories and backing up a narrative. So we've got an example of a report here with narrative, and alongside the narrative is data, charts, graphs, and more quantitative information, which is all relating back to a theory of change and the theory of what should have happened in this particular report. So finally, what if data tells us a different story? It's important to report what isn't working as well as what is working, accentuating the positive without eliminating the negative. So there is ways of couching results that may not have been as you had liked them to be, but you can certainly explain, some of the reasons why you feel results have turned out differently through your monitoring and evaluations than you originally thought. And that, again, is all part of your credibility and the credibility of your learning. And one of the attributes that many funders are now looking for is an organization that is learning. So either way, when reporting something that might be perceived as negative, it's important to highlight what changes you will make to address this. So there's countermeasures that you can certainly put in place should your results not be as they are intended. Again, just for you to come back to after this webinar, there are many different modalities. We've given 9 different approaches here to reporting back information. Some are more innovative and eye-catching, which I'd encourage you to have a look at. So in terms of attracting, this final element, securing new funders, using findings in your proposals. I'm not going to go into this slide, but it's a great example, again, for you to have a look back on in terms of writing a proposal without monitoring and evaluation data and writing a proposal with monitoring and evaluation data. So this really speaks to that role of intertwining your M&E into your pitch and into your story, which makes it a much more powerful proposition than it otherwise might be. Some great resources here just to finish off with around matching the audience and the style and how to tell a story more effectively. So we thought we'd just share these also, and as I said before, we will make a compiled list of all of these resources. Will go out with the follow-up email later, early next week. And then finally, aspect of this idea of securing new funders is highlighting the actual M&E that you do have in place. And we've got an example here of a question within a proposal, within a grant-making proposal, that's specifically asking, please describe your approach to monitoring and evaluation. And what we've done here is just highlighted certain sections that take the reader through the different quality components of an overall monitoring and evaluation section. And often we'll find, this is actually from a scored grant application form, which these were some of the scored points for this particular question that the grant officer was looking for. So demonstrating the quality of your monitoring evaluation system, and here we've got an example of a toolkit that actually communicates the M&E process internally to, so this is for Télé des Hommes, a toolkit that can really, again, add the credibility when speaking to funders that your processes are robust and in place and being implemented. So we often encourage people to utilize these tools. So I realize we are now at the end, and I think we've more or less just got to the end of our presentation. Thank you all very much. And TJ, I know we've just run through an awful lot. Do we have the results of our final poll?
You know, Damien, I must have missed. I apologize. I did not deploy it, but there's still people online right now. I can do it.
Yes. Okay. You know what? I forgot to deploy that as well. So if you've got a chance online, there are quite a few people still online. Please do just complete that poll for us. That would be great. Any final thoughts from your side, TJ? I know we're a little out of time, and I'm rushing through to hit our target, but yeah. Any
final thoughts from experience both in the for-profit and nonprofit sector? A good story usually, in my experience, means a good strategy, whether it be attracting customers or securing donations. So, and then wrapping that all in M&E, be able to tell precisely how the impact of the organization is being enlarged and serving more is a really great story to tell.
Yeah, great. Thanks, guys. So in terms of next steps from this webinar, please do feel free to join any of our future public webinars. There's an ongoing list that's being circulated, and our other knowledge exchanges that we carry out through our learning hubs. We do have an introduction to the InFocus training, the complete training curriculum that's taking place on Thursday, May 24th at 5 o'clock British Summer Time. You're more than welcome to join that. We'll send a link in the follow-up email. And please do feel free to jump on a one-to-one discussion with either myself or TJ about your own organization and how you're going to improve your monitoring and evaluation and fundraising in future. We're more than happy to chat that through. Indeed, we're going to stick around now for the final 20 minutes or so to both answer any questions that you may have. So please do feel free to jot any questions in the Q&A box. We'll aim to look at those and answer those. And
the quick poll, Damien, about 2/3 of the people have voted thus far. I'll give everyone about 10, 15 more seconds if you haven't already done so, and then we'll share those results.
Yeah, fantastic. So I know there were a few questions earlier that people wrote in. I'm just going to try to look at these now and see if we can tackle any of these. But if you have any questions, please do feel free to put up your hand or just write in the Q&A box, and we'll be more than happy to have a chat through on those things.
Damien, I just put up the quick poll results where we want to take a quick look at. Resoundingly, it seems that what needs to change and our end goals, where we're going, came in at number one. And then there was a close tie, 50% for the nature, size, and scope of the problem, force innovations and plans to bring about change, and results achieved to date and lessons learned. That's up on the screen.
Great. That's really helpful. So we've got in lead what needs to change, and our end goals, what we're going to do. Yeah. Where we're going. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really interesting stuff for us to reflect on, as well as in terms of what, which areas of the kind of story that can potentially be enhanced. Now, do you have those, were there any questions, do you have those questions to hand at all, TJ, that...
Yes, I'm expanding it right now. So we have a question from, just bring this out a little bit here. There we go. We have a question from, there's not a lot of time, the question is, there's not a lot of time to write a story, and but it's a beautiful one. And
yes, no, I've got that. I think this is the one that we mentioned earlier, actually.
Okay.
DJ. But actually, let's have a look at, I'm going to pull in Inika, actually. Inika, are you there? I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, good morning. Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Inika.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing? Lovely to hear you again.
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Thanks for joining us. So I see you posed a question.
Right, it's just that we have, the audience that I'm speaking at here in the US, it's so foreign for them, what our kids go through on a daily basis, that like the child marriage, which the way we tell it, because the father wanted 4 daughters to marry at the same time. So this man is being perceived here as, oh, it's the problem. The parents are the problem. The parents are evil. They do this. But the father actually is convinced he's doing something right. It's his duty to take care of his daughters. He doesn't have money for 4 dowries when the kids get older. So when he can throw all 4 of them in the same pot, he actually believes that he's doing something right. Yeah. So, so that's a whole different complex story. And of course, we tackle a part of that problem by giving our children their saving fund at the end of at the end of their school career when they're 18. So we do have a bit of a financial benefit if the girl stays in school, so they cannot use that against us, that it is more expensive for them to marry off a older girl. So, while I'm telling you this is already getting really confusing, because you want people to understand of a far bigger social problem, what is so complete foreign to them. So I can tell them a heartbreaking story about this, and we have so many more, and it involves, domestic violence, sexual violence, all that kind of things. But if you don't, how can you wrap that in a short story with very innocent, can I tell you a story? And then I'm going to overflow them with heartbreaking, horrible things, but it's a bigger social problem.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a promise that in that story that you just shared that I think would be could be communicated to people. So if I'm understanding correctly, that there's a financial commitment if a young girl stays in school to the age of 18. That's kind of like
right. So every sponsor, so a sponsor in FFLV pays $45 a month to have the girl in the school. So we provide them with uniform, books, food, medical, education, safety, whatever, all that. But $5 of that $45 goes into a fund that will be released for the girl when she's one, minimum of 18, second, finished her school.
Right.
So, you know, that tackles two other problems, which is she's sort of registered, she exists, and it could either pay towards a dowry if she wants to get married, or she could maybe use it against her education or start a little business. So yeah.
I would invite you not to leave out all the heart-wrenching pieces of when it doesn't happen and the promise that you have if they achieve those goals. So in terms of the type of story, you know, problem and you're the solution, and in between those two is the promise of, you know, if they choose or can go another way as a result of your work. And then I would pivot to, you know, a story about a young woman that did it, you know, stayed till 18 and continued school and that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Right. So you don't want to confuse. Yeah. Actually, that's probably the question. You don't want to confuse.
Right. And I wouldn't want you to define yourself in the negative either.
Right.
With that said, the important details that you would know on the ground about some of the young women that are involved with the organization, those are important. Those are the details that people need to fall into your story, but then pivot to that solution that you offer and the promise
right.
that you make. That would be my suggestion.
Perfect.
Yeah. And just speaking to a little bit to the sort of you know, kind of brevity of the story and the, you know, trying to get it all in one place. I think one good sort of technique to kind of almost think about as you're telling a story, and I used to do this, was kind of zoom in, zoom out. Because sometimes you can kind of almost feel like you're going into too much detail about something.
Right.
Now you're going down a rabbit hole and you're telling them, you know, the minutiae of this girl's kind of background, and you've maybe gone a bit too far, and you need to then zoom out and you need to go a bit bigger picture. And sometimes you can feel when you're going down a rabbit hole, or sometimes you're too zoomed out and you need to actually zoom in. You start to notice that your audience is actually really animated about this piece, and actually zooming in a little bit further and giving more details in that area. So I think that's the kind of, you know, a kind of metaphor I have in mind in terms of not metaphor, but sort of technique almost of thinking how to pitch this right. You know, sometimes it needs to be that kind of elevator pitch, but other times you might want to zoom in a bit more detail. I think, yeah, go ahead.
The other important piece is I would invite you, there's also a story about the donor or the investor, and you can engage around that. What that looks like on my end would be, what was it about our organization that you know, motivated you to give your first gift? And they'll tell you the story of why. And then what I like to do also is with clients, I'll with their donors or potential donors, I'll say, tell us a time in your life that, you know, you had a very memorable philanthropic experience. And they'll launch into a story of how they were touched by an individual child, or how this organization put their philanthropic support with those served together. And in essence, that story that they share with you tells them how they want to be engaged, you know, going ahead.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Annika. Okay. Well, I'm just looking for any other questions coming in at this time. I don't think we've got any, so I'm going to wrap this thing up and just thank everybody, particularly yourself, TJ, for joining us and giving us your wisdom and insight in terms of fundraising. I hope to sort of do future presentations and webinars with you as well, because I think this is a topic that keeps most people up at night. And
my pleasure. And yes, I look forward to future webinars. They're fun, and hopefully participants are getting some value out of them.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so. And so to everybody who is still on the line, thanks so much for your attention. If you do have any feedback, a little survey will pop up afterwards in terms of, potentially what information you'd have liked to have heard about, a bit more about, and future topics that you'd like to see coming up in our learning series. So please do fill that out for us. It'd be great to hear from you, and have otherwise a nice evening, morning, or afternoon wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.